My name is Chelsea. I use she, her pronouns, and I am with the Denver Communists. I was interested in doing a presentation on this as I just didn't really quite understand the context of what's been happening in Peru. In learning about everything that was going on, it was very much just like, okay, the president has been deposed. Now his vice president is getting sworn in and everybody's pissed. I wanted to understand what the makeup of their parliamentary system was to find out that, in fact, his vice president is a member of his party, and was really trying to wrap my head around like what all of the uprising was about in terms of their anger towards Dina Boluarte being put into office. So I kind of dug in here. I bit off a little bit more than I can chew because there's so much we can learn from, past governments of the pink tide in Latin America. We're also it's argued that we're seeing a new pink tide in Latin America. So I think there's a lot of lessons that can be drawn from everything that's happened there since the 90s with the pink tide. But I kind of wanted to just kind of go over some background, context, developments, kind of where we are and what we're looking at. So I'll just begin by saying that on December 7th, 2022, Peru entered into a state of uproar brought about by a bourgeois democracy in crisis. With the ouster of Pedro Castillo, the conqueror of Keiko Fujimori, who is the daughter of the infamous dictator of the previous generation, and Peru's sixth president in 6 years, or rather fifth, actually. The campesinos and indigenous populations of southern Peru set the country aflame. The fight for the removal of Dina Boluarte and a new constituent assembly represent the fight of all working class and poor people to live with freedom and dignity, liberated from all oppression and exploitation. So again, tonight I'll be speaking on the developments in Peru before the ouster of Pedro Castillo, since, and the path that lies ahead, the challenges, opportunities, and lessons learned from the previous eras of left governments of South America. I'll just some vocab real quick. Campesinos simply means peasants. This is a rebellion led by the peasantry and indigenous communities of Peru. I'll begin by saying that. And a constituent assembly is essentially the rewriting of a constitution, kind of what we saw when Chile erupted in 2019. Let me see if I can, there we go. So just to provide some context in some of the challenges that Peru has been experiencing as of late, just in the last handful of years. I'll provide some background in mentioning that in the past couple of years, Peru has been experiencing new and recurring challenges that provide context to what's taking place now. We're seeing events that have played out time and time again that continue to bring people to the streets in popular movements. With the deepening precarity of the working class and peasantry, the vast resources filling the bellies of capitalists, the arrival of the novel coronavirus, and the intensification of climate chaos, many of the same struggles we witnessed historically continue to play out with higher stakes, deeper pain, and the justifiable rage of those no longer willing to stand by. It can be argued that agrarian reforms carried out in 1969 Peru did not solve rural poverty. In fact, the dismantling of the previously semi-feudal state led to the ability of the peasantry to own plots of land to live in poverty in perpetuity, it seems. Since then, the campesinos and indigenous populations, primarily in the south of the country, continue to experience inadequate access to education, health, and housing. And that number sits roughly around 40%. Peruvians are experiencing also a vast increase in cost of living, layoffs, gender violence, the damage wrought by the pandemic, where they found themselves with less than 100 hospital beds, no oxygen, and no medicine. Hold on, I lost my place. Oh my gosh. The most severe drought in 50 years, a lack of fertilizer for agriculture as the kind of conglomerates have been allegedly hoarding it, and a decrease in export sales from its primarily extractive economy. Last year, the crisis deepened when ships were unable to dock with importation goods, leading to supply shortages and a sharp increase in costs. And there were also some struggles related to that. In addition, Peru is the fourth largest informal economy in the world at roughly 69% in 2019. That means street and stall vending, domestic work, agricultural, and waste management. It also means no worker protections and the high likelihood of super exploitation. And in the age of the pandemic, workers in this economy lost everything and the deep precarity of the state was exposed. These elements, smaller uprising in Peru since Castillo arrived in office, as well as a spurt of popular rebellions in the region in 2019, including Ecuador, Chile, which was seen as kind of a revolutionary moment. And I think what happened with Chile bears some consequence to what's happening now in Peru, particularly as far as the protesters' demands are concerned. In Colombia, another example, mean that a powder keg has been ready to blow for some time. Here we see the precursors to the late mass upheaval. All right, so why Castillo? On the side here, you'll just see a piece of artwork that was done. That's a picture of Keiko Fujimori, who is the daughter of Alberto Fujimori, the former dictator. And the sign just simply says, "For justice and dignity, Fujimori never again." $600 million stolen and 283,500 women sterilized. Now, I don't really know the history on that, but might dive into that another time. So why Castillo? A little bit of background. Regarding him, he's seen as a man of the people. He's a popular government, a leader with a Chavista line. This is how he was voted in, to the dismay of the historically right-leaning and reactionary wings of Peru's political bourgeois class. Peru has been known as one of the few countries in Latin America that has pretty consistently been deemed conservative. Let's see. So as a school teacher and union worker, the campesinos, indigenous people, and some working class people of Peru embraced Castillo as someone who could bring about the change they were so desperately seeking. In fact, in some districts, particularly in the South, not a single vote would be cast for Keiko Fujimori, Castillo's opponent, and again, the daughter of Alberto Fujimori, the former dictator who still holds many loyalists in the halls of Peru's Congress and military. The campaign again was drawn on a Chavista line: nationalization of industry and resources, a constituent assembly, and the meeting of the popular demands of the citizen of Peru's southern regions in particular. Additionally, the largest unions in the country supported Castillo. It was a new dawn. He did not represent the politicians of Peru's past. He wore a wide-brimmed hat, had brown skin, and could identify with those that put him into power. He actually represented them. However, as we will dive into more thoroughly later on, the Castillo government did not follow through on the promise to represent the people in the halls of Congress. For one, Fujimorists, the right wing broadly, and business owning classes sought from before the election to dispose of Castillo. In fact, the promises of the failures of the reformism were all held to bring us to where we are today. Since July 2021, Castillo proved himself to be far less of a threat to private sectors and maintained a neoliberal economic framework. Spring of 2022 showed repression and accusations of paid right-wing infiltration from the Castillo government in an uprising against food and fuel prices that I mentioned earlier, which were excessive and impossible with a lack of jobs or living wages. So protesters there saw that repression and violence by the Castillo government, and it resulted in 4 deaths and 2 blindings. He continued until his last day in office to capitulate and broker deals with the bourgeoisie in class collaboration until the moment he realized the door was closing and he attempted to dissolve Congress, knowing his days were numbered. The reactionary right had no patience for a leftist that represented all it abhorred and had been able to keep at bay in its electorate for so many generations. Sadly, the cards were already stacked against him. Because the Castillo government was brought in on the wings of bourgeois democracy, his platform had a foundation built on sand. So his ouster and the installment of Boluarte. So what happened? Pedro Castillo had been removed and his vice president, Dino Boluarte, was sworn in. It turns out that long before that, in fact, since before the election, the right wing was poised to keep Castillo out of office. His ouster had a bit of a domino effect. The right's initial desire was to completely overthrow his government, including Boluarte. Eventually, she proved herself to be malleable enough and has since appointed a right-wing Fujimorist prime minister. Before the election, a slander campaign was in full effect. There were claims of election fraud and efforts to impeach immediately. Before the third and final successful impeachment attempt, a media smear campaign went full bore as popular support for Castillo dwindled. Still, the peasantry and indigenous populations of Peru offered their full support of the president. The 2 previous unsuccessful impeachment attempts saw charges of corruption and being quote unquote morally unfit, which apparently is a legitimate claim that can be made. By the time the third impeachment came, he was involved in roughly 6 investigations. He had at this point shuffled his cabinet 5 times, which isn't a good look either. As the pressure built and Castillo knew he could not win, he made the decision to completely dissolve Congress, enacting what is called a self-coup. I'll go ahead and read the announcement that he made, the content of which wasn't really broken down and discussed via the news media. It was more or less just a claim of like, oh, that this is a self-coup, everything's falling apart. And so down on the left is a picture that just says a message to the nation from President Pedro Castillo. And he said, the majority of Congress, which defends the interests of the big monopolies and oligopolies, has done everything to try to destroy the institution of the presidency. The executive has sent to Congress more than 70 bills of national interest with the aim of benefiting the most vulnerable sectors of the population, such as the massification of gas, the creation of the Ministry of Science and Technology and Innovation, free admission to universities, the second agrarian reform, the tax reform, the reform of the justice system, the elimination of subsidiary economic activity of the state Congress sought to prosecute the president for treason with unsustainable and absurd arguments from one of constitutionalist jurists. Without the slightest evidence, Congress charged the president with crimes many times, often based on claims by a mercenary, corrupt, and cynical press, which defames and slanders an absolute debauchery. However, the Congress does not investigate and sanction criminal acts of its own members. Congress has destroyed the rule of law, democracy, separation and balance of powers by modifying the Constitution with ordinary laws in order to destroy the executive and establish a congressional dictatorship with the endorsement as they themselves constitutional court. The following measures are dictated to temporarily dissolve the Congress of the Republic and establish an exceptional emergency government. Elections will be called for a new Congress with constituent powers to draft a new constitution within no more than 9 months. So the announcement to dissolve Congress is what made the right wing's third impeachment trial a success, actually. Here he lacked any government support or military support, to say the least, as the members of the left parties finally voted with the members of the reactionary right in the defense of their own congressional positions. I should mention also that Castillo's own party, Peru Libre, lacked seats in Congress, making it already weak. Here we see the spinelessness of reformists elected with willingness to align and bargain with the bourgeois government in self-preservation, abandoning working class and poor people with whom they apparently share common goals and enemies. Their loyalties lie instead with their positions and quote unquote law and order as determined by bourgeois democracy. His actions were a breach to the latter. Castillo was stopped in the heavy traffic of Lima on his way to the Mexican Assembly and arrested on charges of rebellion and conspiracy to be detained for 7 days. He and his family have since been granted asylum in Mexico by AMLO, one of his few supporters in the region. Attempts to hold him for 18 months pre-trial are underway. And it has not been lost on Western liberals that Dina Boluarte is now Peru's first female president. So we're going to talk about the beginning of the uprising, how it began, if my computer wants to cooperate. Let me see. There we go. All right. So on the action-packed day of December 7th, once again, Castillo attempted to dissolve Congress, was impeached, ousted, and arrested, and his vice president, Dina Boluarte, was sworn in, making her the 6th president in 6 years. In swift response, protests begin. By the 9th, actions have erupted in Lima and throughout the southern regions, with protesters readying themselves to move north in the weeks ahead. The struggles, at first spontaneous, are led by grassroots and peasant organizations, all of whom have decided democratically to engage. The first highway blockade appears and clashes in the capital begin. The next day, 2 young people are murdered in the southern city of Andahuelas. Demands are for the immediate dismissal of Boluarte, the freeing of Castillo, a constituent assembly, and immediate elections. Boluarte initially plans to lead through the entirety of the term through 2026, but 5 days later decides to offer elections in spring of 2024. By that same day, 7 protesters had already been executed by the state. Indigenous activists faced the word terrorist as a racist and classist dog whistle by the population against the military. Protesters are also accused of being outside agitators, paid by drug traffickers and other shady entities to discourage popular support by Lima's working and middle classes, who primarily consume bourgeois media. Popularly elected leadership left a vacuum, and in its wake will be the bodies of those killed and the fuel for what could be a revolutionary moment. I wanted to mention also, I keep talking about the southern region of Peru. So in the southern regions is primarily where the indigenous and peasantry communities reside. That is where many of the tourists go to visit Machu Picchu. It's the home of the Aymara and Quechua people. And so when there's been a lot of reporting on it, you'll hear Puno very often. That one's on there. It also included Ayacucho, and let's see, Arequipa is a big one as well. So a lot of the actions that have been happening and the movements that have been occurring have been in the southern portion of Peru. And now tens of thousands of people are making their way up to and have arrived in Lima to protest there in the capital. And that little graphic on the side is just basically saying that Lima is not Peru. So as far as developments, since the first week in December, the struggle has continued unrelenting. A web of road blockades and shuttered airports led to over 5,000 tourists stranded in Cusco, which is hilarious to me. Calls for a criminal investigation arose after it was discovered in mid-December that protesters had been murdered by gunshot, meaning authorities had been using live ammunition. Since the 11th of December, protesters from the southern regions, again, like I mentioned, have been making their way to the capital, Lima, to demonstrate, coalescing in the Toma de Lima, or the taking of Lima. That was planned for January 12th. Protesters traveling from the south have been met with supplies and support along the way, and tens of thousands would arrive in Lima. Nearly a month earlier, a state of emergency had been announced by Boluarte, clearly having no effect on the energies of the people. In this declaration on the 14th of December, the constitutional rights of citizens were overridden in an unsuccessful attempt to quell protests and maintain order. This order strips citizens of freedom of movement, safety from military troops in their homes and private buildings, and freedom of assembly. This 30-day state of emergency would be renewed on the 15th of January, with the lamenting of Boluarte as a reasonable and helpless victim being simply barraged by chaos and violent nonsense. She dared to request, quote unquote, peace and calm, inviting protesters to meet with her to discuss social demands. Quote, I am waiting for you at the House of Government to talk about your social agendas, because you know the political agendas you propose are unfeasible, end quote. In this time, Boluarte has appointed multiple right-wing party leaders in high-ranking positions in her cabinet, had several others resign, has appointed multiple curfews, and been responsible for what is now upwards of 60 deaths. In fact, by then, 2 massacres had already occurred. Her idea of what can be done easily or conveniently is vastly different from that of the demonstrators. The disgracefulness of morality politics has continued to exist as a central theme in winning over the minds of the urban sector and working and middle classes of Lima, who consume, again, mostly bourgeois media pushing this narrative. This rhetoric is used to skew public support and perception and to justify the use of state violence. It's like the phrasing, like it said those people had to die, but they shouldn't have been trying to shut down the airport, and like conversations around justified versus unjustified killing, etc. One excellent example of propaganda organized by conservative and religious groups, retired military and police, as well as right-wing politicians, was the Great March for Peace, wherein marchers wore white and carried a giant Peruvian flag through the streets, with Stein saying, "Democracy is love and united for peace." Tired statements about a few bad actors sowing instability ring hollow as pearl-clutching manipulation tactics used against protesters fighting for real democratic change. The Peruvian National Police had encouraged the public to participate. Boluarte claimed she had no prior knowledge of this event. However, PNP documents show that, in fact, it was organized in an attempt to increase support for her government. This was organized for January 3rd and was a drop in the bucket for all of the continued efforts by demonstrators to keep up their fight. Just 6 days later, the Juliaca massacre occurred, which had since encouraged university students in the cities to begin joining in the fight. This month, 60% of those who took a national poll believe that the protests were justified. 58% believe that police used excessive force, and 44% believe that the protests were organized by citizen groups or spontaneous action. President Boluarte had a disapproval rate of 71%, while 88% of respondents disapproved of Congress. When asked if they supported for the calls for a new constituent assembly, 69% of respondents approved. To this point, the demonstrations have still been composed of the peasantry and indigenous populations primarily. The working class has been slow to enter the struggle, and support for the rise, public perception seemingly open to transformation through the eyes of the urban working class. The lack of entry into mobilization may be attributed to bourgeois influence, political leadership, union bureaucracies, and the reality of left organizations having an electoral focus. However, the people will not care about quote unquote popular support as pushed by bourgeois media while their fellow fighters are being shot down in the street. State violence will simply further fan the flames of rebellion, and has so far. Entire communities from rural areas throughout Peru have organized themselves and marched. In Puno alone, 20,000 members of the Aymara community have made their way to Lima. In Amazonia, indigenous leaders have released a statement which says, "We alert the army, we alert the National Police of Peru, not to upset us because we are in our territory. We will see each other there. There we will surely declare war because they are already provoking us and creating discomfort for us." Protesters have begun mocking police. "Qué triste debe ser matar a campesinos para poder comer," which basically means it must be very sad to kill peasants so that you can eat. Boluarte is no longer just a traitor and usurper, but also a murderer. Police have also played Dance of the Chinese, which was an Alberto Fujimori campaign song in the streets of Lima, and demonstrations begin daily at 4 p.m. The first protester to be killed there in Lima died just 4 days ago. The reactions of the state, we're seeing all the classic lines that are drawn in the realm of repression and violence. Daily clashes, tear gas, and excessive force are the typical features of the day. To be noted, especially those that, again, it is estimated that there are now at least 60 deaths and 600 injuries attributed to state repression from the uprising, featuring 2 massacres and live ammunition. Again, the Ayacucho massacre on December 15th killed 10, and the Juliaca on January 9th killed 18. And protesters took revenge by burning a police officer alive in his patrol car. Both were affiliated with attempts to shut down access to airports. Journalists have been facing aggression, threats, and even a gunshot to the leg, while authorities have abused their powers with detainees and used tear gas and rubber bullets with impunity, causing life-changing injury. No doubt the Western war hawks are finding enjoyment out of the $661,530 of pocket change they've received the week of December 20th to 27th, when the PNP purchased nearly 32,000 tear gas canisters and grenades. In fact, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken did recommend that Boluarte redouble efforts to safeguard democracy and order. It seems in the nearly 2 months of rebellion, even the most brutal repression cannot keep the popular uprising at bay. Interestingly, Peru's Attorney General Patricia Benavides announced on the 10th an investigation into alleged crimes of genocide, serious injury, and aggravated assault against Boluarte and high-ranking members of her cabinet. Now we're going to speak on some challenges of the movement that they're experiencing, and that I think we as revolutionary socialists would see as challenges to the greater goal of creating a new world with new systems of government and economies and all the things. So the challenges that exist around this rebellion are really in the nature of the structure and organization of it. We recognize that we need a unity of struggle and the active engagement of an organized working class alongside the remainder of the exploited and oppressed populations of Peru. So the lack of a strong, cohesive, and organized working class has posed its problems, as well as the reality that most members of Lima's working class are centrist or right-leaning, many of whom do not support the return of Castillo. In fact, the aforementioned January poll saw that compared to other regions, more residents in Lima believed that the protests were terrorism and that the use of force by authorities was justified, while those polled in other regions did not. This difference in views, in part attributed to bourgeois influence, results in a sort of alienation of the working class from the struggle, as well as their conservative nature. Can the working class and peasantry come together despite some in their ranks existing as a barrier to workers' freedom? The poll also found that President Boluarte had a disapproval rate of 71% in Congress of 88, This I already mentioned, but I'm going to read it again. And then, being asked if they wanted a new constituent assembly, 69% said yes. It seems, though, that there's a disconnect between the commonly held beliefs in Lima and the rest of the country. It seems the peasantry has less of a focus now on the return of Castillo, but rather they're having control over what and who comes next. Unfortunately, due in large part to the messaging of the bourgeois media, many believe that what is at stake is democracy. Since the protesters have been labeled terrorists so thoroughly, there's a sort of buy-in from the working, urban, and middle classes that end up propping up the violence of the state through a justification of violence to defend that democracy. That those who challenge the state are those that cause harm, as if the state is natural and needs protecting. The working class is concentrated in Lima, and only 40,000 of those workers are unionized. In the mining industry alone, there are 450,000 workers. A challenge is certainly the physical character and the fragmentation of groups across regions and industry as well. Add to that number, the reality of the deep bureaucracy of unions. They have recently begun to advocate for and plan strikes, which is a huge sign for the possibilities and opportunities of the movement, whereas before there was great hesitation in engaging. These unions dedicate themselves to negotiation with bourgeois governments and have prevented the working class from joining mass mobilizations that have arrived in the cities. In addition, the left parties and organizations of the country throw up a similar blockade, the blockade of electoralism. They, as dedicated reformists, have prevented those rank and file members of the left to engage in the struggle and avoided making any proclamations about their stance in this fight. We are beginning to see these trends slip away as Peru is further engulfed in struggle, but the nature of their reformist positions are posing their own challenges, insofar as the only call for struggle is the struggle against the actions of Congress in the dispensation of Castillo, not to fight for the true aims of the working people, which lie in the content of their desired constituent assembly. They aim to restore the power to bourgeois democracy, not the people themselves. It is here that these quote-unquote left groups, parties, and organizations betray the struggle. Of course, Castillo himself was a member of one of these reformist parties, Peru Libre. At this juncture, it is imperative that the unity of the working class in urban sectors and the peasantry from rural sectors come to fruition in order to propel the movement forward. In the absence of any revolutionary program or organizational leadership with the power to unify classes, we must hope for the lessons of revolutionary moments to take place in the streets and watch the natural partnership evolve and spring into the next phase of the rebellion. All sectors of the exploited population must join the ranks of those who have carried the torch thus far. Damn it, doing it again. Okay, well, I wanted to talk about Castillo and kind of South America and Latin America's legacy of reformism. And so to continue the discussion around challenges, we have to examine the ways in which the popularly elected government of Castillo was already off to a start on failing in meeting of demands, and how that's a common theme throughout governments of the center, left, and left. The proof of the failures of electoralism and reformism is in the pudding, and the situation that Peru sees itself in today is a direct result of those failures within a capitalist system. The abandonment of the most basic measures promised by the Castillo campaign becomes a necessary act to appease the ruling class. Nothing, including the promised constituent assembly, will get done to make any meaningful advances for working and oppressed people, because it's designed that way. In fact, these reformist governments most often arise as a response to struggle. These candidates and platforms arise that tame social movements and reduce levels of struggle. What is distinct about prior eras is that an economy like Peru's, and hence many others in the region, simply cannot even buoy the governments of leftist candidates. Even meager reforms cannot be funded. In the era of the pink tide, these countries all look to extractivism to inject money into their coffers after revolutionary moments had against neoliberalism and free market anarchy. Social programs and redistribution were possible in this age of the commodity boom. However, this would end in the 2010s. This is the reality of the situation of deep precarity under the current circumstances of capital. Chained to a capitalist system of economic organization, we will be chained to a system of deprivation. These left governments often hold gradually shifting priorities and messages to the populace that brought them to power. As is the case in Castillo's story, with installations of these new governments, transformations by the dominant and existing parties of the right also, quote unquote, ride the waves and adjust as necessary to have their aims ultimately achieved. Here, it was the plotting and planning to find ways to overthrow Castillo. Now they have succeeded in their goal and know that his vice president will be just fine to operate their aims through, as she is ready and willing to bargain. Juntos por el Peru and Peru Libre, which are the two primary left parties, again, that Castillo is a part of, Peru Libre, have proven themselves through this debacle that it is not possible to make changes from within the state, and that it is certainly impossible to make them with any sort of conciliation with the bourgeoisie. So as far as the pink tide goes, I want to just touch on that a little bit. It began in 1998 with the election of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela as a reaction to the adoption of unpopular and devastating neoliberal policies by several countries in the region through the 1990s. Also elected were Lula da Silva, who is Brazil's newly elected president, second time around, Evo Morales in Bolivia, Kirchner in Argentina, and others. This event, if you will, spanned over the course of several years, with populist progressive governments winning elections after massive social rebellions by the disenfranchised working classes and peasantry. Extractivism, devaluation of currency, privatization, public sector and manufacturing jobs dismantling, inflation, destruction or cooperative bureaucracy of trade unions, unrestricted movement of capital, which basically just means without regulation or subsidies, cutting off social spending, export economies, etc., are all the classic features of neoliberal restructuring. It was during these administrations that many Latin American countries had their commodity industries nationalized. After the fall of the commodity boom in the 2010s, governments were forced to turn to international capital. Prior to this, millions had been pulled into the fold of political life and pulled out of poverty. However, within the framework of global capitalism, these economies were only a house of cards, dependent upon rentier capitalism. Without the expropriation of the bourgeois class and a total transformation of the means of production, reformist left governments are doomed to crumble under the pressures of global capital, and that they did with a reactionary rightward swing after many of these administrations. It is being said, I mentioned earlier, that Latin America is experiencing a new pink tide with the election of many popular left candidates, including the aforementioned Lula back to Brazil, and Gabriel Boric of Chile, which itself faced a revolutionary period in 2019, which led to a constituent assembly that ended up being rejected. So they're kind of back to square one there. And I don't need to do a whole lot of arguing as to why that is an argument against reformism. Proof's right there. In fact, many of the leaders of today's new pink tide were also members of the last. Unfortunately, it looks that it will be more of what didn't work before. So, kind of start wrapping up. I have to jump around since my slides aren't really working. But I just kind of want to begin concluding by saying that this movement is powerful and it's an undeniable challenge to the state. If the demonstrators, if the protesters, if the rebellion wants it to be. Right now, I would say that it is not. Their demands are not any sort of radical demands in any sort of like meaningful way to really change the shape of Peru. But it is an undeniable challenge to the state if they want it to be. And with that, there is a revolutionary potential at play. And as is often the case, a viable next step hasn't been available in the mass consciousness for a revolutionary outcome. With an overthrow that I hope they can achieve, there must be a clear continuity of organization from below and an installment of the dictatorship of the proletariat resulting from these revolutionary moments. The demands haven't changed, but the fury has risen and grown in large part due to the reaction of the state. At this juncture, there doesn't appear to be a particular vessel that can direct the steam anywhere beyond the demands at hand. The desire for a new constitution goes beyond the desire for Castillo in office. It is a call to improve the lot for the peasantry of Peru. Castillo was simply a representation of what they're after: dignity, well-being, rights, liberation. The movement believes the way to achieve these aims is through a new constitution, whether we agree with the effectiveness of that or not. All of the pieces are just that, they're pieces. But still, if the ruling class sees themselves under threat of an overthrow by the masses, it may concede to some sort of constituent assembly. It would not be sufficient, and that it would be a long and grueling process, and mechanisms would be placed to ensure that the powers that be continue to maintain that power. This is why we need an organized, centralized party to carry the rebellion through to the next stage, one of directed and transformational power that would remove bourgeois parliamentarism entirely, with a workers' party rising from the ashes. And with that, I'll say, like, again, that brutal state repression is failing to quell the protests, and arguably it's intensifying the fire and the rage of the rebellion. We are now seeing more calls for national strikes, for general strikes, which will include more layers of the working class, which again is something that we need. More presence of protests in Lima may encourage members of the working class to join protests or raise popular support in the city and the region. The militancy of these protests is really profound. They're burning down judiciaries, police stations, police cars. We're now seeing students once again joining in the protest and showing solidarity. The protesters that arrived from the south in Lima were welcomed by students at two of the main universities, who had taken over the facilities to provide a place to sleep for those who had traveled long distances in coaches and minivans. And the people of Lima had provided food, water, and blankets. Some workers are beginning to join the protesters, and I've heard reports, though I don't know if they can really be verified, of Army reservists joining in on the fight as well. So my kind of hope at this point would be that the layers of the working class become involved in this rebellion, because again, we need that mass organization to really push something through and have a plan. And also hoping, of course, that consciousness can be raised in a short period of time. So there's a lot of feelings around what is going on in Peru, what has happened. I think the legacy of the pink tide provides its own challenges, yet at the same time, its own opportunities in the direction that this could take. But if we don't see working class involvement and working class support, things will likely end up exactly the same. Some of the organizations in Peru are promoting solidarity, the workers' organizations, and encouraging members of the working class to join a revolutionary process. And so consciousness is starting to shift. There is work being done to create common struggle against capitalism with working class involvement once again, and people are starting to organize with more intention and coordination. Campesinos from the South have begun organizing with peripheral oppressed populations of Lima, and organizations like Partido Socialista de los Trabajadores Peru, or PST, they're making headway and working to produce propaganda to the movement and intervene in the popular struggle. And they're kind of a branch of like Workers' Voice and the Fourth International and all of that, just for some background. It is stated that their goal is in solidarity and the unification of struggle to carry the fight forward all the way.